Another common step after placing your wall elements is to create floors at each of the different levels in your model. You place floors by sketching boundary lines to indicate where the floor should be created. So similar to walls, you sketch a line. In this case, you need to sketch an entire boundary, and the floor will be created within that boundary. You can set the floor type and properties either before or after creating the floor element. The first step is to choose a floor type from the type selector. So switch to a plan or a 3D view and open the floor tool. It appears under the architecture tab in the build section. You'll find the floor tool there. Choose the desired floor type from the type selector in the properties palette. And the floor types that are available will be defined in the project template that you used, or you can copy floor types from other projects or even define new floor types. Before you sketch the boundary lines, you should set up the boundary sketching options. In the options bar, you'll find a couple of important options. The first is extend into the wall to the core. When you turn on this option, it automatically aligns boundary sketch lines with the wall's core faces, which you'll find out is a very helpful way to set up floors. If you don't align the floor boundaries to the wall core faces, you may find that the edges of the floor are visible at the exterior surface of your building, and typically we don't want that to happen. So it's much better, typically, to go through and align the edges of the floor to, I'd usually align it to the exterior core face, which would then make the floor sit on top of the structural materials at the core. Another boundary sketching option that you may want to turn on is to enter an offset distance between the boundary sketch line and the desired floor boundary. You would use this if you don't want the floor boundary to go all the way to the wall, but you want to introduce a little bit of an offset distance. Next, it's time to actually sketch or pick the boundary lines. And here you could either select a sketching tool to draw some lines. You'll find the line and rectangle tools, a polygon and circle tool, as well as arc, spline, and ellipse tools, all in the drawing palette. Now, you can draw the floor boundary, but it's actually typically much better to use one of the pick tools to choose the existing faces of the walls and actually have the boundary lines aligned to those. If you pick the faces of the walls, the floor boundary is actually aligned and locked to that wall face, so if the wall ever moves, the floor will stretch with it. You'll find that both the Pick Line tool, which lets you select any line and draw the boundary there, as well as the Pick Wall tool, which is usually the one that I use. After you've created a complete boundary, it has to be a continuous loop, so you may need to use the Trim tool to clean up the corners to make sure there are no overlaps and no gaps in the continuous boundary. You can click the Finish checkmark to create the floor element. After you've created a floor, you can edit an existing floor in several ways. Start by selecting the floor. Then you can edit the instance properties to either change the associated level or enter a height offset to have the floor raised above or slightly below the floor level. You could also choose another floor type in the type selector if you'd like to apply an entirely different type of floor at that same location, or use the Edit Boundary tool to reopen the boundary sketching and change the boundary lines of the floor.